series, What If Christmas Hadn't Come? If you weren't here last week when we started this, typically during the weeks leading up to Christmas, you would kind of build toward the excitement and the anticipation of Christmas. That's usually how this goes. We wanted to reverse it this year. So last week we started by assuming the truth of Christmas, and then we're asking the question, well, what if it had never happened? I heard from a lot of people last week after service. I got emails all during the week, and the most common response was like, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about that. I'd never taken the time to stop and ask myself, how different would the world be if Christmas hadn't happened? Like the plot of every time travel movie. If you go back in time and you could change a kind of original event, what alternative string of events would that have led to? And then ultimately, what kind of alternative reality would we be living in? That's what we're doing in this series. We're asking that question. And we started last week by saying, Christmas birthed into the world. God with us in the person of Jesus birthed into the world and into human imagination what Jesus called the kingdom of God. You think about the kingdom of God as a completely different way of thinking about being human and thinking about how you organize human life together. Nobody had ever thought in the terms that Jesus revealed to the world, and it changed everything. Not overnight, slowly over time. Indeed, it's still changing everything. Jesus compared it to a person who takes a little bit of yeast and mixes it into a huge batch of dough, or takes a tiny little seed and plants it in the ground, but the seed has the potential to grow into this huge plant that can cast shade and everybody can kind of rest in it. This vision of the kingdom of God, this alternative way of thinking about what it means to be human and how to organize human life for 2,000 years has been permeating the dough of human culture. But the reality that you and I experience every day, we get up, is like a gigantic plant. And we are like the birds nesting in its branches. Things like universal inalienable rights or basic notions of equality. Those things were foreign concepts. People didn't have buckets in their brains for that 2,000 years ago. There weren't people in the world building hospitals to care for the sick. There weren't people in the world building schools to educate everyone. The idea that there might be some kind of global peace was not a thing. The Romans talked about a pax romana, but what they really meant was nobody's stupid enough to come in here. It wasn't the idea that we actually love and care for other people who are unlike us, and we want to seek to live together in a way that doesn't require violence and killing people. Those ideas did not exist in this world. They were birthed into the world and into human consciousness in Christmas. Pretty much everything that you and I take for granted as being the most beautiful aspects of what it means to be human are rooted in Christmas. If Christmas hadn't come, we would be living in a very different place. But what I want to do over the next couple of weeks is probe the ingredients of the kingdom. I talked about them, or I introduced them last week. I called it transcendent authority and transcendent story. That these are aspects of the kingdom. Think about it as this is the stuff that makes the yeast the yeast. It's the stuff that gives the seed its potential, its potency, what allows it to grow into something. I want to drill into both of them a little more deeply so that we can spend a little more time. While I recognize it's a little dystopian, and during Christmas we're a little more used to, upbeat hope and all that. That's kind of the nature of the series. Is if we can spend some time reflecting on how different and how dark the world would be if it hadn't been for the first Christmas, well then when Christmas shows up, you're going to be mighty glad it did. So let's talk today about what I call transcendent authority, okay? So just by way of review, authority, of course, is the right or the ability or the power to command other people, to compel other people, to make the decisions, to call the shots. Transcendent means outside of or beyond. The birth of Jesus into the world as God with us confirmed that there is such a thing as transcendent authority. a God who stands outside of you, outside of me, outside of the material world, who has the power, the right to compel us to live in ways we otherwise would not. And that specifically has to do with the social order, right? The moral, ethical realm, how we live together as human beings. So remember our friend Isaiah, the prophet, poet? Isaiah compared human community to the animal kingdom. So in the same way that in the animal kingdom, you have wolves and leopards and lions and bears, and what wolves and leopards and lions and bears do is they attack and they devour other creatures, like lambs and baby goats and calves and cows. It's just what they do. It's how their world works. And Isaiah imagined the human social order in a similar way, that there are the rich and the powerful and the strong, and what they do is they attack and they devour the weak and the poor and the helpless. That's just the way the world works, and it always has. But he imagined that one day it could be different, that there might come a day where wolves didn't attack and devour lambs, that maybe wolves would lie down peacefully with lambs. But in order for that to happen, they've got to be compelled to do that. They're not just going to do that on their own. And in a similar way, Isaiah imagines a world where the rich and the strong and the powerful don't attack and exploit the weak and the poor and the helpless. But if that's ever going to happen, then the people who have are going to have to be compelled. And that's exactly what Jesus comes compelling people to do. And you heard it in the passage that was just read for you. What does Jesus command people to do? And I noticed as it was being read, I noticed how many exclamation points were in the passage. I hadn't paid attention to that before. I mean, it's almost like Jesus is shouting this. And he says things like, love your enemies. Do good to those who harm you. Bless those who curse you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other and offer it also. Lend to people that you know can't repay you. If someone takes something of yours, don't fight to get it back. And Jesus has to compel people, command people to live this way, because he says, otherwise you won't. What will you do? What will I do? What have people always done? You will restrict your love to people who love you. You will do good. You'll just do good to people who do good to you. You'll have no problem lending. You'll just only lend to people who you know can repay you. Because that's just what we do. It's the way the world works. We have to be compelled to do otherwise, to do things like love our enemies and do good to those who harm us. But here's the thing, and this is kind of the big idea for this morning that I want you to wrestle with. Isaiah's metaphor, as all metaphors, no metaphors are perfect. Metaphors help in some ways, and they also obscure and hide in some ways. And Isaiah's metaphor is not perfect. You see, we know that in the animal world, in the animal kingdom, in the natural world, it's perfectly natural for a wolf to attack and devour a lamb. It's what they do. They're hardwired to do that. For a wolf to ever lie down peacefully with a lamb, we would look at it and we would say, that is unnatural for them to do that. So by Isaiah comparing the human social order to the animal kingdom, that might lead you to believe that what Isaiah is saying is that for you to love your enemies, for you to do good to those who harm you, to bless those who curse you, to lend to people who can't repay you, to not fight to get something back that's been taken from you, that to do any of those things would be unnatural. But that's why they're so hard, right? It's so hard to do those things because they are unnatural. They don't come naturally to us. That's why we have to be compelled to do them. But Jesus doesn't talk about it that way. This is something I really want you to wrestle with. Jesus doesn't compel us to do these things like someone who's trying to get us to fight against our nature. Jesus is not trying to get us to push water uphill. The way he talks about it is that to do these things is perfectly in keeping with our nature. In fact, it is the fulfillment of who we actually are. You notice the language that he uses? He says, if you do these things, if you love those who harm you and pray for your enemies and bless those who curse you and love your enemies, if you do those specific kinds of things, that is evidence that you are living, the phrase he uses, as true children of the Most High. That to be compassionate in these ways, though they are uncommon, they are actually quite natural. You are to be compassionate just as your Father is compassionate. You see the language? Father, children. So in Christian theology, human beings are created in the image of God. And more or less what that means is that you and I are supposed to reflect God's nature in our nature. That what it means to be us, to be human, is to reflect who God is and what God does. And who is God and what does God do? Jesus tells you. Jesus says, my Father is kind. Specifically kind to people who are unthankful and wicked. Jesus doesn't say God is kind to people who are super grateful and have got all the ducks in the row and they're just great people. What makes God God is that God is kind to people who are unthankful and they are wicked. In other words, God is someone who loves God's enemies. God does good to people who harm him. God blesses those who curse him. God lends to people who couldn't possibly repay him. That's who God is. To behave in those kinds of ways, far from being unnatural, though they may feel that way because they're so uncommon, is perfectly in keeping with our nature. It is, in fact, who we are. It is a picture of the fulfillment of what it means to be human. Loving your enemies and doing good to those who harm you and lending to people who can't repay you actually isn't an issue of nature. Take the N out and put an M in. It's an issue of mature. It's a maturity issue. It isn't that it's unnatural for us to love our enemies and to do good to those who harm us and to lend to people who can't repay us. It's that you and I are not mature enough to do those things on our own. That we need a revelation, an authority in our lives to model, to teach, to compel, to empower us to do what we otherwise would not do in our immaturity. This is a super important distinction, I think, for you to wrestle with, because throughout human history, there have always been people who have justified the way of war, the way of violence, the way of hatred, the way of might makes right. There have always been people who have tried to justify that way in the world as if it is our natural way, the natural human order. There is so much, even today, contemporary thought where human beings are simply reduced to, we're basically sophisticated wolves. We're like animals. And everything about us can be explained in terms of evolutionary science. It's all about survival. And survival, of course, is by any means necessary. There are people who believe that what is most natural about us is that we compete and conquer. That we will do whatever we have to do in order to make sure that tomorrow we're still here. even if it means they're not. What Jesus birthed into the world is the revelation that the opposite is actually true. This is not a revelation we would have come to on our own. We know today it is not natural. It is not natural for us to kill one another. It is remarkably unnatural for us to do that. We have to work exceptionally hard. We have to take good men and women, and we have to spend years training them and conditioning them to overcome the psychological barriers to have to kill another human being. And no matter how much time we take to condition them to psychologically be able to do that, it's never enough. Because whenever they come back from combat, the trauma that they suffer and that they represent reveals that this is not something we're wired to do. And we don't just have to talk at that level. You can talk about something that's far more pedestrian and localized. For you to hold on to hatred and resentment, to make villains out of other people and to keep them there, takes an enormous amount of psychological energy. Let me just ask yourself, if you can, if it's not too painful, imagine a scenario where you were harmed and you feel like you are the 100%, you're the victim and the other person, right, was the perpetrator and you were harmed. How much time and energy have you had to spend to keep them in that place? How many times have you found yourself driving in your car, rehearsing some story in your mind or out loud about an imaginative conversation you would have if ever given the opportunity? It's like you have to keep rehearsing it and keep rehashing it because it's not natural to hold on to it. It takes a ton of time and energy, and it's not good for you, is it? How many people are spending hundreds and thousands of dollars with therapists trying to figure out how to get over or overcome hurt and resentment and anger and hatred? It is not natural for us to live that way. Prior to the birth of Jesus into the world, we would not have known that. We would have thought the exact opposite, and people still do. People still think we are basically sophisticated wolves. Well, let me tell you something. If there's a wolf who's too small or too slow or lame or gets injured, the pack doesn't stop to take care of it. They leave it behind because it threatens everybody else. We are not wired to live that way. You know, I watch a lot of TV and movies. I love pop culture. One of my favorite shows is The Walking Dead. If you're not familiar with the AMC series, it's a story about a pandemic that effectively turns people into zombies. They call them walkers in the show. The show is not about the zombies, though. The zombies are just a fun way of imagining the end of the world. What the show is really about is what human beings do when they imagine the world is coming to an end. There is a philosophical question at the center of the show that I think is remarkably, incredibly provocative and probing. And the question is, who really are the walking dead? Are the zombies the walking dead? Or have the humans somehow become the walking dead? The ones who are still alive and still human, but in order to survive, they feel the need to do incredibly subhuman things to one another. It sort of probes can you really rebuild human society on that? If you got a bunch of tribes and the basic operating principle or in the world is we're going to build our walls and we're going to get our weapons and we're going to kill anything that moves that isn't us. Can you even have human community that way? Right? The show's kind of asking, are the humans revealing what is most natural about us? Or are they betraying what is most natural about us? I think Jesus would say the latter. What's most natural about us is our ability to transcend these basic animal instincts, to do what animals can't do, which is love our enemies and do good to those who hate us and lend to people who can't repay us. That's actually what it means to be human. It's the fullness of what it means to be human. The realization of that, the ability to do it, was birthed into the world at Christmas. Jesus doesn't compel us to do these things like a commanding officer forcing us to do things that we otherwise don't want to do or are unnatural to us. Jesus is a lot more like a loving parent, taking a young, immature child and saying, left to your own devices, you'll never do this. But I'm going to model it for you. I'm going to teach it to you, and then I'm going to compel you to live this way. You would never eat your vegetables or go to bed on time or put money in a savings account or read a book. Not because those things are unnatural to you or because they're not necessary for your flourishing. They're perfectly natural to you, and they're absolutely essential to your flourishing. You're just too young and immature to do them. But now that I'm here and I love you, I'm going to model it and teach it, and I'm going to demand that you do this with me. That's what's happening at Christmas. Literally birthed into the world is an entirely different organizing principle for human community. It's mercy. It's kindness. God is kind to the unthankful and the wicked. Now, I want you to imagine for a second, as terrifying as it is, imagine if for the last 2,000 years, there was no such principle let loose in the world. If not a single human being on this planet for the last 2,000 years did anything motivated purely by mercy and kindness, specifically mercy and kindness to the other, right? Not to the people who are kind to them, but to the other. What would the world be like if for 2,000 years, the last 2,000 years, the world was not organized according to mercy, but it was organized according to mercy's opposite? What a Catholic theologian named Walter Casper calls the economy of exchange. Imagine if for 2,000 years, every single human interaction was governed by the cold calculus of exchange. I gotta be honest, as I was preparing for this sermon and I asked myself that question, I could not stretch my brain wide enough to really take in or fathom the consequence of that. It's like my soul immediately felt the weight of just how incredibly dark and merciless the world would be if that had been true. But it was hard to almost pinpoint really compelling examples of it. How do you extract mercy as an ingredient in human life and then even be able to imagine what it would be? I mean, the logic of exchange in my mind, demands a couple of things. That there are malevolent things you will always do. You must always do. And there are benevolent things you will never do. Exchange demands that there are malevolent things you will always do. You must always do. You must repay any harm with harm. Either equal in severity or escalating. You can literally never, under any circumstances, let anything go. Evil must always be repaid with evil. If someone insults you, you have to insult back. If one coach plays dirty, you got to take the gloves off. If one business is breaking the rules, you got to break the rules. God forbid someone were ever to harm or kill a member of your family, you got to show up to the sentencing hearing. And when the court gives you the 5 or 10 minutes to speak, you got to make sure to make the perpetrator feel as guilty and ashamed as you can possibly make a person feel, and then tell them that you hope they rot in hell. You have to do those things because that's the logic of exchange. You can't ever let it go. Nothing. Imagine if for 2,000 years you had billions of people who could never, under any circumstances, let anything go. If every wrong had to be repaid with an equal wrong. That's terrifying. And then you flip it and ask, well, what would the world be like if nobody ever did anything out of pure benevolence? Because exchange says you can't. You can't do anything unless there's some kind of a return on investment. Benevolence means you do it for nothing in return. No guarantee that it will benefit you in any way. Can you even imagine? If for 2,000 years nobody was ever motivated to take in a foster child. Nobody was ever motivated to adopt a child with special needs. If nobody was ever motivated to give their lives to caring for the sick and the dying. If nobody was ever motivated to give their time and their energy and their talent to take care of people who are sick or poor or homeless. If nobody ever was willing to live with people who have leprosy or AIDS or who are dying of starvation. Nobody gave themselves to helping migrant families get an education. Because these are things you don't do for return on investment. Because there's no guarantee there'll ever be one. You can give your entire life to a child, only for that child to spit in your face and spurn every good thing you ever did for him. There's no guarantee you will ever get anything out of that. You understand what I mean by overwhelming? Can you get to get your mind around? If for 2,000 years, think of every single thing that you do on a daily basis that you have zero guarantee or interest that any return will come back to you, you do it anyway. You do it purely because you believe it's a good thing or a right thing to do, regardless of whether it will come back to you or not. And what if all of that just disappeared? Think of every evil thing that you on occasion have the inclination to say or do, but you hold it back and you don't do it. Because somewhere inside of you, you know that it would simply be wrong to do, even if you can't explain why. And then imagine there was no more of that holding back. Imagine if, like upriver, the dam broke and all of that evil and wrong just came flooding down the valley. Guys, the world that we live in would be an incredibly dark and merciless place. I cannot even get my brain around it. But here's the thing. The world isn't like that. Specifically because of Christmas and this organizing principle of mercy that was birthed into the world that has changed everything. Like sometimes we think that the world is held together by law and law enforcement. And don't get me wrong, law and law enforcement are incredibly important and necessary. But they are only important and necessary specifically because we still have people in the world who aren't operating according to the logic of mercy. They're operating according to the logic of exchange. They reduce all human experience to what I want and what is it going to take to get it. Right? Today, we need international law that says you can't invade a sovereign country and kill innocent people. And we have to have an international community that's willing to enforce that law. But only because we still have people in the world that think that's a perfectly fine thing to do. If that person were simply operating according to the logic of mercy, then should the inclination to do something like that pop into his head, the very next thought would be, you know what? I can't do that. I'm not allowed to do that. God has made it very clear that that is a subhuman thing to do. I am called to be compassionate and kind, even to people that I don't particularly like. And if that person were to think that way, you would need no law and you would need no law enforcement community to enforce it. You see, it's not law and law enforcement that holds the world together. And it never has been. It has always been mercy. Always. Mercy has always been at the center of the universe. The only thing that holds the world together is a logic way deeper than the logic of exchange. It's a theologic. It's a knowledge of who God is, birthed into the world and human consciousness in Jesus, and that knowledge infiltrating all of human culture, including your life and your moral, ethical imagination, so that today there are just simply things you could not even fathom doing that 2,000 years ago were commonplace. If Christmas hadn't come, you and I would be living in a dark and merciless place. We are not living in a dark and merciless place because of what Jesus birthed into the world. My fear is that if people who are supposed to know that, right? Like you and me, you know, the people who come to church every week and say we love God and we believe all this stuff. If we do not fully understand and appreciate that, if the truth of that has not sunk deep down into our conscious imagination, then it's possible that despite the fact that it did happen, we'll just live as if it didn't. And the world can become just as dark and merciless a place as it would have been otherwise. Not a natural place, but a truly unnatural place, a subhuman reality. One that operates according to the cold calculus of exchange instead of what is truest about us, and that is to be merciful as our Father is merciful. Thank God Christmas did come. Thank God Christmas came. 2,000 years, mercy has been loose in the world, and it has changed everything. And it can continue to change everything, right down to your individual human heart, if you'll take Christmas seriously.